like is going to greatly change your interview process, but just know that it doesn't take long to screen an application in detail. I've related it to football because it's football season. 2-minute drill. It takes about 2 minutes for me to thoroughly look over someone's application. And I put this screenshot in here because this is a lot of the information that people will skip over very quickly, but this is also very important to you when you're screening for the quality applicant. You need to know when they're going to be able to start, if they've worked here before, what other information like their personal information that they put in there, address is important too. Are they even local? That's going to tell you about what your interview process is going to be. You may have to Skype if they chose them for a second round of interviews. And I'm sure some of you have done that. Have you ever been convicted of an offense against the law other than a minor traffic violation? This is not a disqualifier, but it does give us an idea. Maybe if it was last week, it's too soon. So definitely want to pay attention to that. Yeah. All right, phone interviews. So we're going to talk about the format of the overall interview process, but phone interviews would be the first step once we have screened and decided what applicants we're interested in learning more about. Why do we have to do a phone interview?
Figure out which ones you want to call in for an in-person interview.
Mm-hmm.
And narrow down the pool.
What's the value in it?
Saves a lot of time.
It definitely could save a lot of time, whereas many people think, I really don't want to go through this extra step. It actually is saving you about an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah, a lot.
So, and for other people for that matter. So, absolutely it's a time saver. What beyond that? There's many reasons.
You get an idea if they're truly qualified or not.
How?
Well, depending on the answers to their questions, you can tell, pretty quickly,
Right.
If they know if they know their stuff, if they know what they're talking
And
about.
that too, but you put down their minimum requirements, say a bachelor's degree.
Exactly.
Just because they got a bachelor's degree doesn't mean they're the person for that position. And
Exactly.
you can talk to them on the phone and go, wow, this is a killer applicant, or it's no way. This right
That's
here
been
would
my
never
experience
work.
with the phone interviews.
Mhm.
They look really good on paper, and you get to the phone interview. And it's
Uh-huh.
And phone interviewing is a different skill, is it not? It's not the same as sitting in front of someone,
Yeah.
picking up on verbal cues and kind of gauging your answers off of someone who doesn't have a poker face. A telephone interview means you really have to articulate. And so that's a skill in and of itself that's measured. It also, which we can tell when someone has prepared for the phone interview. And so, other than the fact that it's now required, those are good reasons why we would want to do a phone interview. Who should we include? Well, we should include the chair for that committee and an HR rep and one more person max. There's no need for more than 3 people. At this point, you got to think about how much you're really saving if you start including too many people. So that's why we don't want to include a big group in that ordeal. So 3 people max, definitely want to have an HR representative there. How many phone interviews should you expect to do?
Depends on how many applications you actually receive.
That is the textbook answer. That is the textbook answer. So typically let's talk face to face for a second. It takes about 5 good qualified applicants to choose the best applicant. That's the statistics. Okay. So if you extrapolate that for a phone interview, you would like to have 10 or 15 to say, these are the best 5 applicants, and then I can choose the number 1 applicant with confidence. But of course, it does depend on the number of applications you have. If you got 1 application, is it still good to phone screen? Absolutely. Let's not waste an hour and 30 minutes on an interview if they can't get past the phone screen. So That does depend. How many questions should you ask in the interest of time? I would say 3 to 5 questions. Every now and then, I do see one where there is 7 questions. You may be able to justify that, but the next question kind of answers that for you. What types of questions is really going to affect how many you have to ask. So if you ask effective, and as we were talking about before, why is a phone screen necessary? And we said that we talked about minimum qualifications. That's the types of questions you're asking to get at minimum qualifications, preferred experience. You can do that in 2 different questions easily. Usually what we like to do is a warm-up question. We'll give some examples of that because it's not very different from a face-to-face interview, but a warm-up question, and then 3 to 4 skills-related questions. Knowledge, skills, abilities, experience. That's really all we want to know in this phone interview. So, knockout questions is kind of how we like to think of it, basically. If they can't answer this question to your satisfaction, then it's not worth bringing it for a phone interview. Maybe if they answered it partially, it would be worth bringing in for a face-to-face interview. How long should the phone interview last? About 10 or 15 minutes. 20 minutes max. We schedule our phone interviews in 20-minute intervals. Sure, you're going to have the talker, someone who's a little loquacious and wants to go into depth about their Mazda 6 and how they got it on their last job. But then you'll have others who really don't take any time. They take 5 to 7 minutes for the whole interview. So you're going to have both. But I would schedule them in 20-minute intervals because, again, we don't want it to be taxing. That's the whole purpose of the phone interview. We want it to be quick, concise. Did you find out what you need to know? And some tips. So some tips and things that I've run into. It's completely acceptable, you as the chairperson or the person setting up those interviews, to call a potential candidate who you want to set a phone interview up with and ask them if they have time to do it then. That is acceptable. If you're in the market for a job, that doesn't negate the preparation aspect. So you should be able to sell yourself to me quickly. That's part of the preparation, as soon as you know you're in the market. So that's acceptable. It's acceptable to ask them if they want to set it up later that day if they have time. If you're in a crunch is what I'm saying, or if you just want to assess all your people that way, but try to keep it consistent. It's also acceptable to end a phone interview with an invitation to the face-to-face. That's fine as well. So, moving on to the actual interview piece. The first thing I would say is that everything in this slide relates to consistency. That is the main thing with any face-to-face or interview process in general, is consistency as much as you can strive to achieve it. I want to point out the interview toolkit first, which we're in the process of putting that all online. So the interview toolkit is actually just a folder that we have right now that as soon as we know that you're interviewing, because we're in the process, we'll be sending that to you. As soon as we get it up on the helpful files by department on the intranet, then we will be letting everyone know that it's there as well. What you'll find in there is pretty much everything you'll need, from the way that the interviews are set up, the phone screens, what you need to do to set up on the day of interview, the procedures for walking in a candidate. Everything is here so that we can really streamline it and make it standardized across the board. So if you don't have it, contact myself or Mike Messersmith or anyone in HR and we'll get it to you. But it will be on helpful files by department as well. So The first point there is again about consistency and doing the same thing every time. The second point is about the rating scale. So we'll go over that, but first, what's the point of keeping score on these rating forms? Does it mean the person with the highest score always wins, like basketball? No. So what's the purpose then? If it's not that I'm giving you a grade and the highest grade wins, what's the purpose of keeping score?
It's almost like calibration in a way of the interview committee so that they can go back when they're talking about things and look at the score they gave that individual along with any notes that they wrote down to really talk about that applicant in an almost objective way as you're going into the decision round.
Absolutely. Yep. So the number one reason actually that we have a scoring system is for our own consistency, much like when we grade in school. That's number one. You have to have an objective system to grade the same way every time. And so you yourself as a person on the committee should always be going back over your scores, and you should be filling this out completely so that you can say, I gave this person a 4 out of 5, and I was getting ready to give this one a 5 out of 5, but did they really answer the question any better than this one? You will also notice, because committees talk about the candidates as they should, you also notice that if you score higher or lower, if I score higher or lower than you, then generally that'll be the same on most candidates. It's not that we'll give them the same score, it's just that our scoring is consistent. So that's reason number one, but then also moving past that, then of course it's going to be to evaluate that candidate against others. But that's why we keep score, and that's why it's important. Talking about the rating scale, I want to pull the rating scale up so we can see just a few changes that have been made. So first, going over the actual criteria, I know that that's very small, but the main difference here is that instead of having a 1 through 5 scale where 1 and 2 are connected within the same description and 3 and 4 are connected within the same description, now we've kind of separated that out because it is different. And because in our experience in going through the interviews, this is a question that people had over and over. They couldn't really, they had a hard time differentiating, is that a 2 or a 3? Is that a 3 or a 4? So that's there for clarity purposes when you're looking at this interview toolkit and the applicant rating form. The overall rating of the applicant, also something that has come up many times because we do a committee style of interview. So once we get to talking about the candidates, we're not sure if we should circle it now or circle it later, or are we all agreeing, or are we all putting our own opinion? And that's something that has come up. So I would like to clarify that recommend for hire is who you absolutely feel like is the number one candidate. That can be your own personal opinion or what you've agreed upon. The goal is to agree because we're a committee. But you are on this committee because if you feel strongly about your reasoning for not wanting to make that your number one choice, then you should put it. But that's what recommend for hire is. Possible hire means that you would have no problem extending an offer to this candidate. So by those means, if 3 out of 5 said recommend, 1 said possible hire, or 2 said possible hire, then it's really not an issue. As long as we'll talk about the chair's role, but as long as the chair agrees with that. Not recommend, I think is self-explanatory, but under no circumstances would you recommend that person. The last thing I want to talk about is the competency or skill addressed on there. The majority of people do not use this, but that's really going to guide your question. If you can't really clarify what competency or skill is addressed in your question, it's probably not a good question. Or it's not worded in a way that you're going to get the response that you desire from that candidate. So that's why it's there. And of course, last thing I will say on this sheet is the notes. In the notes portion, you do want to write notes because it's not going to be fresh, everything from that first candidate. We will talk about candidates after they've exited and the interview's been closed out, but it's not all going to be fresh. So you do need to take notes as thoroughly as possible. But please do not write down anything that does not relate to knowledge, skills, abilities, or experience. Other things we always consider. You know, if the person, for example, told you that they quit their last job because it was such a far drive, and this is the exact same distance, yes, we're going to consider that because you've just told us some valuable information. But that's not something we need to write in the notes because that's not a knowledge, skill, or ability or experience. That's not something we can standardize across the board and compare from one applicant to the next. That's just information they offered up because we wouldn't ask that because it wouldn't be a legal question. So, moving on. So we talked about the rating scale there. We talked about the overall rating of the applicant. And now we want to give you just a rundown of the updates that we've made to the interview process. So this is also going to be included, it is included in the interview toolkit. It's an interview process chart, and the first sort of bullet here gives you just different options to how to structure your interview. It can go any way. I've seen it, you know, where we introduce the candidate, we sit them down, we ask them questions, and then we do a demo, and then we come back to questions. That's fine, as long as you do it the same way every time. I've seen it to where we do, you know, the intro, the demo. You know, you can mix that up many different ways, but the intro and the after interview session, which we'll talk about, those need to stay at the front and the end, respectively. So selecting a demonstration type, I know for a while it's just been either you do a teaching demo or you don't have one. But there's value in seeing an actual demonstration in the skills that are most pertinent to your job that you're hiring for, no matter what it is. You know, for example, if I'm in HR and you know my position in recruiting qualified candidates, and I have an upset person who has not heard anything about the job, and I'm dealing with my boss, I'm dealing with several things. If you can observe that in a 10-minute time span, that's valuable to you because I can tell you anything I want in the interview with a cool face and calm, collect attitude. But until you see it, you really don't know. And so there are many situations that we've kind of just outlined here, but you're not limited to this. This is your choice in how you approach it. But the demonstration piece is a mandatory part of the interview process, unless it just doesn't make sense. I'm sure that situation will arise, but probably more than 90% of the time it'll make sense. The after interview session is an informal question and answer with team members. And this is optional because it doesn't make sense in every situation. And we've identified some of those situations where it may not make sense. It may, you know, you have to make this decision as the chair or the committee. Because let's use an example. If there is an internal candidate who really doesn't want to broadcast to the college that they're interviewing for this position, you might have to make that decision that it's not the most valuable thing to you in the process there. But this is to get some more feedback from your staff, to get a buy-in from your staff that they have an impact on this decision as well. And also you may see something different from what they've seen in an informal setting than what you saw in your formal question and answer and demonstration. So there is a form that we have yet to finalize, but it will be included in this packet too. It will be finalized this week. So it will be there and available to you. And also there's there's a little disclaimer at the bottom just saying that whatever structure you choose, it's an implied task that you're going to have to communicate that to your search committee. they need to know what's going on in the interview process as well. And there are also directions down at the bottom. So. And also, one more thing I forgot to mention about the after interview session. Even though HR is not going to be physically present in that session, we definitely want to have a sort of quality control role in that, because you don't want to just have your staff asking questions that they shouldn't be. So we do want to be informed in that role, and in that process rather. So there will be an HR presence in the after interview session, maybe not physically, but we definitely want to structure part of that. Ideally, it would be 1 or 2 questions, and then, hey, what would you like to know about the job? But with that said, your department does need to know what they shouldn't answer, just like in the interview today. So there is some preparation that goes into that, and you have to kind of weigh whether it's valuable for you or not in that situation. Facilitated discussions, what this is referring to is after we're done, and we're done with all of our candidates, there's a little bit of a difference that you've all seen, I'm sure, between we're doing 5 interviews in a row and the first candidate just left, and you give your kind of initial impression of the candidate. There's a big difference between that and your discussion at the end of the process. And what is the difference? What's the difference?
The discussion at the end of the process, you're comparing multiple candidates, whereas after each interview, you're just talking about the one candidate
Sure.
as an individual.
Sure, one's a reaction, pretty much.
And the other is to make a decision.
And the other needs to be more standardized. And so that's what we're getting at when we're talking about a facilitated discussion. I have witnessed a lot of discussions that go in circles at the end of the interview process, because it's not, really it should be the chair, but it could be anybody that says, well, what do we think about just the interview today? You should be talking about the interview. You should be talking about the application, education, I'm sorry, not the application, but you should be talking about the interview, education. You should be talking about work experience relative to the position. You should be talking about those things first and foremost in your rankings of candidates. And then you can talk about whatever else that may be a factor. She came in dressed in flip-flops. That's kind of a factor, because that's a preparation factor. You didn't really prepare for this interview because you didn't know what you were going to say, and because you didn't know what you were going to say when you were asked to tell about yourself, it spins us into this, whirlwind of your personal life. So those are things we'll discuss too, but what I'm saying is, I've seen it happen where people do not go down the list. Check, check, check. We talked about education. We talked about experience. We talked about the interview. That's how you evaluate candidates fairly. And then you can talk about the rest of it.
Is there going to be a sheet that could guide them? I hate to keep trying to create a sheet for a sheet for a sheet.
Right.
But we have a sheet that is for the individual portion,
Mm-hmm.
but then when we go to this facilitated discussion at the end, there really is nothing. And so that makes the whole group just do random things.
Yeah, absolutely.
To where we do, I think, really well when you have the individual, because at the end of that, you can go down that sheet and you can discuss it.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you get to the comparison of
Mhm.
everyone, there's no real guide other than these
Yeah.
individual chairs that choose to do whatever they do,
Yeah.
or the strong person on the committee that takes it over and does what they do.
Yeah.
And so, again, I don't know if there's a way to take the individual form and then make a comparison form where you can do a comparison of each applicant.
Yeah. That's a good question.
And again,
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and
a
I've
good question.
actually done that in the pre-screening process to decide who I want to call for a phone interview. And I, just make, like you said, a checklist of all the qualifications I'm looking for, and then indicate whether they meet that or not,
Right.
to see how they all stack up.
Right. And that's a good question. Certainly that's something that we're thinking about, just with we're getting feedback, basically. So we could do it all in one form. We could do it on the rating form. there are pros and cons of each. So that's something that we just,
Even if it's just for the chair to have that form, so they know how to keep the next part together, not to create extra work for the committee members.
right.
But if the chair has something to keep it as a facilitated discussion versus the way it
There's
kind
even
of
talk-
goes off the track.
Yeah, there's even talk of kind of what you just said, of using the candidate selection report for that, to kind of, even though that's what you're doing at the end, that's what you're gonna have to talk about anyway on the candidate selection.
Right, so that
So-
would be perfect.
So that's something, but
Mhm.
hopefully HR is involved in the process anyway, helping to guide that talk, but certainly that's something that we want to do in the future, is
Or if
create
it
a
was
form.
HR that always started that part of the role for the facilitated discussion instead of the chair,
Yeah,
because then it would be consistent. When you have the chairs, it's not really their job,
yeah.
day in and day out.
Right.
So they're all going to apply this concept so much differently, loosely, versus if HR facilitated that discussion because you know what needs to happen based on HR principles for hiring. Because we come at it just from our job and what we do daily.
Right.
So if you guys started that discussion that led the rest of us to the right place,
Yeah,
I think that would be consistent,
Yeah.
if we're looking for consistency, because there's gonna be no other way to obtain consistency if it's these random individuals with no real HR experience in the hiring process, because we're gonna look at what makes us feel good. Right? I'm not being,
Sure.
it's just as objective as we are as people, when you're in that moment, you're looking at what makes you feel good, I've gotta work with this individual.
Right, your gut instinct.
You're on instinct, right?
Yeah.
Versus you guys are gonna keep it objective based on HR principles, which is gonna then get the committee to that objective place, versus us when we lead it at the end.
That's a
we
really
just-
good suggestion.
that's a good, yeah, that's a
We
good
all do our
thought.
own little thing.
I mean, there
I
is
was thinking
a,
that that's, it's great at the end, but the beginning as well.
Yes.
When you're looking at the structure of it.
I agree.
The introduction
Yes.
headed by HR.
I agree with that
So you're
completely.
keeping it consistent, so every applicant hears the same story.
Otherwise, you're not gonna have that, because chairs are chairs and we come in and we come out
That's true.
of committees, and we can be a huge part because we know the job portion better
Right.
than HR, but the beginning of interviews and the end of interviews really aren't about the job
No.
portion.
And it's more tactical.
It's
too.
more tactical, right? And you're expecting tactical operations out of people
Yes.
that may be the one and only committee they do in 2 years.
right,
Yeah.
3 years,
Right.
5 years, I don't know.
They may be new to their role.
New to the role. And so the only consistency, if we're saying it's so important for interviews to keep them consistent, HR really would be the consistent piece. But that's just my experience from being in them.
no, that's a
And
good,
you can take it for what it's worth in one person.
that's a good suggestion. Again, this is the
Yeah.
piece that, we're still getting input on. So that's definitely why we do these things, to get that sort of input.
Because I'm sure like Target didn't just let random people hold the interviews all the time, right? I mean, there
Mm-hmm.
was usually probably a very consistent way the interviewing happened.
Yeah, a lot of differences there. We won't get into that.
Yeah.
So that, I've written that down because that's a good suggestion, so we'll take that back to the fort. So to end this, the chair, the role of the chair is really one that the final decision is the chair's. We're a committee, and so we want to come to an agreement, but we're not gonna force a decision on someone who has to live with that decision. So understand that the final decision will kind of fall on the chair, especially when there's a debate between 2 qualified candidates, which does happen. This is an important thing that I definitely had to touch on. We have a lot of internal applicants at CCCC, and that's a good thing. But the biggest thing that we're not doing as a college is preparing them. And that is not solely an HR function. That is a function of that department, of those coworkers, of those chairs and deans. So we really need to kind of school them on what's appropriate and inappropriate in an interview. For example, we're not going to act like we don't know the person when they enter the room. So, I may say, hey, Denise, you doing all right today? Yeah, pull yourself away from the desk for 5 minutes for the interview? Okay. Once we say, are you ready to begin? Flip the switch, and we need to kind of educate them on what that means. So, for example, just a few things that I have seen be effective and some things that were inappropriate. One thing that was appropriate that I've seen is doing mock interviews with a person, especially if it's for a level up type position. That's fine, as long as you're not the person on a committee, because that's sort of a conflict of interest if you know what questions are being asked. So as long as you're not on the committee, yes, do a mock interview with a person, that's great. Also, being part of a committee for someone who is a coworker, with the exception of what we just said, the mock interviews, that's okay too, but you have to understand that there is a line. You know, if Denise or Daisha, who are my HR coworkers, wanted to do an interview, well, I don't hang out with them on the weekend, we don't barbecue together, and they don't keep my kids. So I have no issues with that, evaluating their work performance. I have seen actual committee members tell me, I shouldn't have done this. That was too hard. When you know that, then you should probably just say that. There's no shame in saying that. Okay. Some things that I've seen candidates do that we need to kind of alert them about, like in the skit. Just because you have internal knowledge of different departments does not mean that it's appropriate in a phone interview, is when I observe this, to ask about what the pay difference is in another department. That's inappropriate. That's completely inappropriate. How did I do at the end of the interview? So how was it? Inappropriate. You know, these are things that sometimes could be summed up with a simple, if you know the person's applying, if you don't, you don't. But with a simple, hey, I just want to let you know, this is going to be handled the same as it would be for an external applicant. Okay, so just know that. I have done that several times, and it's worked well. When I haven't, I've seen these examples. So just keep that in mind. We need to prepare them better. Think about interviewing the internal candidate if you have multiple. Think about interviewing the internals last. Kind of helps you to not skew your judgment so badly, because you already know them, actually. You are going to pull in things that you know about their performance. And that's okay, because it is a performance-based decision, okay? But you can also compare them better if you've already seen the external applicants, because you can see what they answered on questions and what the internal applicants were not able to answer on questions. And you know, just to talk about one more thing with internals. Everybody thinks that, you know, we know who they are, we know what they've done. That's not correct. If you've sat in on a phone screen with an internal, you may realize that preparation comes back to haunt them, because they've never talked about their job in a way that qualifies them for something different or similar or a promotion. So phone interviews, definitely don't. There's no way to get around it. The phone interview is still mandatory. So there's extensive research on this topic. I have a lot of it at my disposal if you ever want. All right. These are just really quick, some good questions, bad questions. You know, good questions generally get good answers. Bad ones, same story. We saw this in the interview, or in the mock interview that we had. Tell us about yourself is a bad question. Why? It's too broad. You just told them they could talk about anything they want to talk about. And how do you evaluate that? You can't. So the other question is a better question. If this is an actual question that was asked in an interview, by the way. Okay, and what is it trying to get at? It's trying to get at the same